don't know where we have been, but we are here. Oh yes, and we are here. We are one in a million. One of us here and another one on the way.
All right, Thrill Seekers, that was a bit of a song called We Are, and that is the first song on the very first Dementia 13 album, the albums I made when I was in my 20s. And it is a remake that I just did a couple of days ago, but the original version is also up on the YouTubes, so I'll put a link below to both of them in the description so you can check them out. You might like the song because it is probably the first song that I wrote about Buddhism, and if you can figure out why it's about Buddhism, I'll give you a prize. Also, my hair, I don't know what happened. This is the way I looked when I woke up this morning. If I could get it to do this deliberately, that'd be great, but I don't know what I did. So just enjoy the hair while you can. After I put up the video about UG Krishnamurti that I did a couple of days ago, a friend of mine wrote me an email and asked me an interesting question that I thought I would try to answer in this video. So here's the question. And as you know, since before your sun burned hot in space and before your race was born, I have avoided a question. My friend says, one of the things Yuji often talked about, which seemed really alluring, is the idea that once he achieved the natural state, as he called it, it was a physiological change in his body that could not be undone. I gotta admit, reaching a balanced state outside the grip of thought that couldn't be undone sounds really appealing, though I've never heard or read any Buddhist make such a claim. Do you have any thoughts or personal experience on this topic? So yeah, I do. I thought I'd share them with the world as well as with the guy who wrote me that email. That is one of the interesting things that UG Krishnamurti talks about, and I realized after I made that video I didn't really talk about what were the things that he talks about that were interesting. I like a lot of what he says. He says things like there is no such thing as enlightenment and there is no such thing as mind, and I just watched a video when I was preparing for making the video that I made, in which UG Krishnamurti kind of goes on about why the body doesn't want pleasure, which I think is a really interesting point that is very rarely brought up by people who talk about this stuff. But it was a very good point about why what we regard as pleasure is really mostly us, the sort of system of thought forcing something on the body that the body really doesn't want. You know, it's really more like an excess. Everybody wants a pleasant experience, but what the body really wants and needs is a kind of even experience, and not a pleasure experience, and certainly not a painful experience, but a kind of an even experience. And that, I think, is what we're going for in Zen, and that's what we call the balanced state. That's what Nishijima Roshi, my teacher, called the balanced state. And that is much more significant and, in a sense, could be said to be much more pleasurable in a way than what we normally define as pleasure. And these are great things that UG Krishnamurti points out. But it's different. For example, that idea of there is no such thing as mind, there is no such thing as enlightenment. This is something that you do find in the Zen tradition, but they've been working with this. This is maybe why a tradition is a little bit more powerful than an independent teacher, or maybe a little bit more reliable than just one independent teacher, that sort of pratyeka Buddha thing that I talked about in my previous video, the self-enlightened person who doesn't come from any sort of tradition or rejects all tradition, is because a tradition does talk about this. And in Buddhism, even people like Dogen, definitely, and Huang Po, aka Obaku, talks about this a lot. This idea that yeah, there is no such thing as mind, there is no such thing as self, there is no such thing as enlightenment, yet we have to use those words anyway, because in order to convey something to each other, we have to talk about it. Otherwise, you end up giving people the impression, as U.G. Krishnamurti often kind of almost comes right out and says, that you could just lay around on your couch watching the Three Stooges for 2 hours and that would be the same as meditating, which is what I actually did that last night. I watched the Three Stooges for 2 hours, and I found out that the best Three Stooges comedies are the ones in which Charlie Chase was involved. So Charlie Chase was a silent era comedian who did a bunch of films on his own, but later on he became a producer and director and writer and worked with the Three Stooges mostly during the year 1938, and those are the best, in my opinion, the best Three Stooges comedies, the ones where it really strikes a good balance between, the slapstick stuff and actually a more thoughtful, even slower, quieter sort of comedy. Anyway, there's my Three Stooges opinion. I should do a whole video on them. But this thing about permanent enlightenment is what my friend asked me about. This, let's look at it again because I have a terrible memory. A balanced state outside the grip of thought that cannot be undone, and how appealing that sounds. I reject this idea of permanent states of enlightenment because I think it is a kind of a trap that people fall into. And ironically, this is one of the things U.G. Krishnamurti keeps warning people against getting into. And yet some of the things he talks will lead people, like my friend, and like me, I was even reading that going, oh, wouldn't that be great to have this permanent state? But I realize I don't think it's actually possible. Now, one of the things that Dogen says is you won't necessarily be aware of your own enlightenment. And my own teacher, Nishijima Roshi, took that a step further, and he said you cannot be aware of your own enlightenment. So there is a difference, I think, between the sort of natural state, if we want to use U.G. Krishnamurti's word, or the balanced state, which is what Nishijima Roshi talks about, and recognition of the balanced state, and recognition of the natural state. I don't know if there's a condition in which somebody can be permanently stuck in that sort of balanced or natural state. I can only talk from my own experience. So let me talk from my own experience, because I did something years ago which was kind of going against the Soto Zen tradition, which I talked about my so-called enlightenment experience. And I put the scare quotes in there and call it so-called because I want to make sure people understand that even though I have to use that phrase to describe the experience, I really don't like the phrase that I'm stuck with using, which is kind of what we have to do in the Zen tradition. We realize that these ways of describing these things are inadequate and actually ultimately false. And yet we also acknowledge that if we want to talk about it, we have to call it something. And calling it by the name that's been traditionally used, Satori or awakening or kensho or whatever you want to talk about, enlightenment experience, etc., etc., is a way in. But it's good to remind people that any idea you have of what this experience is, that idea is false. Dogen has another quote, I wish I could remember chapter and verse where this comes from, but it's something like, nobody ever says, this is enlightenment, just as I expected. Because it's nothing like you could expect it to be, no matter how carefully you construct your expectations of the state. It's going to be completely different from anything you ever conceived of it being. So that's one part of it. I mean, I know there's like Daniel Ingram out there who I've been meaning maybe to do a video about, who claims that he's had the experience and he can tell you all about it, and he's even stolen hardcore. He calls it hardcore Dharma or something like that. He stole that from me, which is, I think, kind of hilarious, and doesn't acknowledge that he got it from me, but obviously he did. But he describes this, and he talks about it being a permanent state, and he's kind of achieved it, and it's, he can sit there and tell you all about it. I'll tell you about mine, though. I think one way of understanding what this experience is to understand it as a moment when the self, you have this sort of construction in thought of what you are. Everybody has it. I have it. You have it. Everybody has it to some extent. Every human being has it to some extent. And most of us get so involved in this construction, we don't even realize that it's something we've constructed through thought that's been shaped by various people telling us how to look at things and how to understand our experiences in the world, and so on and so forth. And the so-called kensho experience, one way to understand it is that it's a moment when that just drops. Dogen called it dropping off body and mind. And that's, I think, a good way to describe it, because it does feel like every sense of what you had of what body is and what mind is are suddenly just gone. And most people, and I count myself as one of these people, for most people it comes rushing back. It's like that scene in the Ten Commandments. Probably nobody's seen the Ten Commandments. Was ancient even when I saw it, but I got to see it as a kid on a giant screen in Nairobi, of all places. But there's a scene where Moses is crossing the Red Sea, and God has parted the Red Sea for him, and as soon as he gets across, it comes rushing back in and drowns all the I think it's Egyptians that Moses is fleeing from. And so it's kind of like that. It goes out and then right back in again. And I think in terms of time by the watch, for most people, it's almost instantaneous as measured by any sort of timepiece you might have. If there's an outside observer watching it happen, which usually there isn't, it would seem to be over and done within, a second or two, probably. That's my guess. But the subjective sense of it is that it covers the whole of time, including the time before you were born, the time before your parents were born, to quote the old Zen saying, the time before the dinosaurs were born, and the time long after the earth has turned to dust and cinder and been burnt out. It's all right there. Bing! And then suddenly you're like, bah! I'm back and I'm Brad again. And you got to figure out what to do about that. I think that's how it is for most people. And it's good to have some kind of training or grounding in it. This is what I think is great about the Zen tradition, even though there's a lot of things I don't like about the Zen tradition, and there's a lot of things I especially don't like about the contemporary Zen tradition as it's expressed in the United States and even Japan too these days. There's a lot to not like about it, but what's good about it is that there is a tradition of people who have had this experience to draw on. There's literature, there are face-to-face encounters you can have with people who've had this experience. But everybody who's had this experience, once they come back into their own personality, we have to figure out what to do about it. And if you don't have anybody to kind of bounce it off of, then it's like anything else that you don't have somebody to bounce it off of. You, even though this state is sort of transcendent over any sense of personality that anybody could possibly have or make up, it's also, when you come back into your own psyche and your own sort of box, that box that you created for yourself, then you've got to figure out what to do with that box. And I think all of us probably, it's trial and error, and I'm glad that I had a teacher around to help me through that stage. Koben Chino Roshi, who was my first teacher's teacher, apparently Tim had told me that somebody asked Koben, what's the most difficult time in working with a student? And Koben apparently said, right after they've had their first enlightenment experience, because it can just make you a little crazy and cocky, and some people go off thinking they're the king of the gosh darn world, and then those people end up sometimes starting religious cults or crazy things because they don't know what to do with this experience. And I would count Yuji Krishnamurti and Jiddu Krishnamurti as people who went through the experience independently and then managed to do something positive with it. Though I mean, they went wrong too. I mean, Jiddu Krishnamurti's problems are becoming well documented these days. He kind of kept them under wraps while he was alive, but now they're sort of coming out. I don't know, I think Yuji Krishnamurti was kind of more open about his own trials with it, but I think he was one of those people who might have had too much of an ego to be able to admit that some of these things were mistakes, But anyway, leave that as it may. I don't think there is a state that just holds on permanently, because in order to navigate your way through the human world, you need a personality. That sort of box that we have that's ultimately false is also really useful. And even Yuji Krishnamurti, to just get back to him, admits this, that you gotta have that. And he also talks about how it doesn't change. It doesn't really fundamentally alter that personality, that personal self that you have. I would say it does necessarily change it in some ways, but it doesn't permanently erase it or alter it or make it good necessarily. And you could conceivably be a very deranged and evil person and have this sort of awakening experience. I suspect, I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect some of the, I'm not going to name names, but fill in whoever you want. Some of the most evil people in history might have been people who had at least a little glimmer of this sort of so-called awakening experience, and yet their personality flooded in and enabled them to use that awakening experience as a way to do bad things, because it provides one with a sort of deep insight into how people work. And you could conceivably use that to your personal advantage. I think that's been done. And I think that's one of the dangers of it, because it's not like you suddenly become psychic, although that does happen to some people. But you can just see somebody and go, I know what that person wants. I know where they're going with that. I may not know all the specifics that went into what, got them there, but I can tell exactly often what they want and where they're going, and just go bing, bing, bing. You don't want to say that to most people, because they'll fight you and they'll get upset and they'll go, you don't know me. You just don't. I don't bother saying it, but I can just go, sometimes and go, okay, got that. But you don't necessarily attain the ability to see that with your own stuff either. So that's one of the things that's tricky about it, which is one of the reasons having a teacher is a good thing, because there's somebody else who's got that kind of insight and can help you figure out where I'm going wrong on this stuff. So yeah, I kind of strayed away from the subject. I don't think Yuji Krishnamurti is lying, so I want to be careful to make sure you understand I'm not saying that. But I just don't think there is this permanent forever enlightened state. It just doesn't. It's a myth. It doesn't exist, and a lot of people out there, not Yuji Krishnamurti, I don't really think he's one of them. But there are a lot of people who've used that myth of the permanently enlightened being as a way to become a super manipulator and to be like, look, I'm because you can play it. It's like a role you can play. You can study sort of even the sort of stereotypical way it's done in movies and TV shows and just do that. And if you couple that with some genuine insight, it's a powerful thing, it really is. And you can manipulate the hell out of people by having a certain amount of insight and by being able to play that role of the permanently enlightened being. It's very like this, and I see that you are a seeker, and now I will help you seek the thing you seek. So, yeah, and here's another thing just thought of as I was talking that I like about Yuji Krishnamurti is he really talks about that aspect of it, about how phony the whole guru thing is and how it's just a kind of a scam that a lot of people pull, and especially people who don't have much else going on in their lives that they can draw from and sort of make a living out of. If you can pull the scam of being the special awakened being, that can be a really powerful draw, and that can get you chicks and money and whatever else you want. It works. I shouldn't say that because somebody's going to go out there and just do it probably. Anyway, that's it. No such thing as permanent enlightenment. If you want to ask me about that, that's my opinion about that. And, if you don't like my opinion, that's fine. But you should like my hair because it came out. I don't know what. Wish I knew what I did. Anyway, if you want to contribute to me on my ongoing experiment to figure out how I got my hair to come out good today, you can go to the URL that you're seeing below, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. And actually, most of your money will not be going into hair research. It'll be going into buying Ziggy food and buying me food and paying all my bills and expenses. So I really appreciate your support. But like always, you don't got to support me if you don't want to. We will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Bye. What do you think? Is there a permanent state of enlightenment? Do you think you can be enlightened all the way permanently? I know, today it's rainy and cold out and you just feel like sleeping in your little Ziggy bed, don't you? Little stretch. It's cute. Thank you for stretching for the peoples. All right, Ziggy, I'll let you rest. I know, it's tough. It's tough. Bye, Ziggy.